Hey, this is Super Game Ghost, and you're watching. With the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC being out for about a month now, many have beaten or are close to beating the game. The game itself has a very favorable review aggregate, and the overall consensus is that the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, much like Elden Ring, is a masterpiece in its own right. But is this truly the case? Or is this game just an overhyped regurgitation of the base game? In order to determine how the DLC really stacks up, let's look at the most striking criticisms and both the good and bad aspects of Shadow of the Erdtree. One of the most prominent criticisms of Shadow of the Erdtree has to do with its difficulty. Most notably, many players have expressed their frustration with the difficulty of certain bosses in the DLC. I can understand the frustration of these players, but at the same time, what did you guys expect? A cakewalk DLC following arguably one of the most anger-inducing games in existence? I might be in the minority here with this take, but comparatively speaking, I actually don't believe that the DLC is that much harder than the base game, especially with all the free Shadow Tree roids scattered all over the place. Personally, I think that Consort Radahn was really the only boss in the DLC who was exceedingly difficult to take down. But even then, I don't think he's harder than Millennia or even Radagon plus Elden Beast. And no, I'm not going to use the old tire argument that one must get good, nor am I even remotely close to being a top tier elite player. I actually suck at this game. Instead, I believe that in most cases, the root of the DLC's difficulty problem stems from an unwillingness of the player to adapt to new challenges. Players have found great success in their respective character builds in the base game, and have beat its most punishing adversaries. So why now would they change things up for the DLC? This resistance to change becomes an issue against the DLC's bosses, who are admittedly much more aggro than the bosses we were used to in the main game. This, in my opinion, consequently is what accounts for at least a good portion of the so-called steep difficulty curve. But what do I know? I used Mimic Tear, a Colossal Bleed Weapon, and a Great Shield to beat Radahn. So my opinion is probably invalid because I don't play the right way. Another criticism that pops up most frequently is the issue with recycled and overused content. This next one for me is a much more legitimate grievance that players have with the game, although it might not be as nuanced. Yes, the DLC has added many cool and unique enemies, items, spells, and so on. But there's also a good chunk of enemies and items from the original game that make countless appearances in the DLC. The issue with the enemies isn't too egregious, since it does make sense why certain mobs would be in certain areas due to lore and world building. But why all the low-level smithing stones? I don't know, but it felt like almost every single area has a random smithing stone 3 or 5 for some reason. I get that they were probably put in so players could level their newly acquired DLC weapons, but we already have bell bearings for that, and I would rather have had new items in place of these. The additional ancient dragon stones were a good idea, but all the other stones seem to just be filler for me. The bigger issue in terms of overused content or mechanics, yet again, has to do with the bosses. As previously mentioned, the majority of the bosses in the DLC seem to be overly aggressive, to the point where even just stepping through a fog gate means that you'll be met with an instant charge attack from the boss that takes 3/4 of your health. Don't get me wrong, this could be a legitimate design choice for 1 or 2 bosses, but why is almost every boss like this in the DLC? Was this to punish summon users? Lastly, the greatest sin committed in Shadow of the Erdtree in terms of recycled content is Radahn. They literally took a boss from the base game and reused him as the last boss for the DLC. Many were disappointed by this and were hoping to see either just Mikola or Godwyn as the final boss for Shadow of the Erdtree. However, there are others who actually claim that they were psyched about seeing Radahn as the last boss and that he is intrinsically different than the base game Radahn since we get to face him in his prime, so to speak. Personally, for me, the only real difference between the two Radahns is that one rides a horse and the other one is ridden by his boyfriend. Initially, during the DLC's development, the president of From Software, Hidetaka Miyazaki, commented on how big he expected the DLC to be. He said that if you think in terms of size, the DLC will be comparable to Limgrave. That was clearly a huge understatement. The DLC is absolutely massive, not only in terms of map size, but the overall amount of content packed into what seemingly should have only been a supplement to the base game. The Shadow of the Erdtree map itself consists of 8 distinct regions, with many of these regions also containing subregions and other points of interest. The DLC also includes 4 to 5 huge fortresses / castles chock full of secrets, items, and enemies. There are also the smaller dungeons with the familiar catacombs and lava intakes, which are new to the DLC. This is equal to about roughly half the size of Elden Ring's main game experience. On top of that, you have hundreds of new items, spells, armor, etc. Then there are somewhere along the lines of 40 to 50 bosses, depending on whether or not you're including NPC invaders. I'm still in awe at how unbelievably huge this DLC is. It's simply unreal. The sheer scale of this game alone is enough for me to forget about whatever minuscule technical details are lacking or need improvement within this behemoth of a DLC. Many are even calling Shadow of the Erdtree Elden Ring 1.5, since it's so much closer to being an entire sequel as opposed to a traditional smaller scale DLC. This is hard to deny since the DLC is significantly larger than most standalone games. Elden Ring's aesthetic and visual style is personally what has drawn me to the game the most, especially the many awe-inspiring areas that you encounter throughout the game. Shadow of the Erdtree could have very easily cut corners and recreated many of the base game's areas, but instead FromSoft really went above and beyond by creating some of the most gorgeous and interesting places of any FromSoft game. My personal favorite of these being the Shaman Village. The Shaman Village is an abandoned village in the northeastern part of the map. It is thought to have been where Queen Marika resided before she came to the Lands Between. This place has a peaceful ambience to it and is indicative of From Software's knack for creating these visually stunning places that aren't even necessarily overly complex or elaborate. The Shaman Village even features a much more calm and serene version of Elden Ring's main theme. Other than the beautiful landscapes and settings, there are also the epic boss battles, which are equally, if not more visually stunning. The boss fight that really stands out for me in this regard is the encounter with Bale the Dread. Everything is just epic about this fight. The jagged peak's overall look and feel, the lead up towards the peak summit which is strewn with dozens of dead dragons, and of course, the over-the-top voice acting performance from Egon.
Curse you, Bale!
The Bale fight is just too good and has got to be the most satisfying boss fight in Shadow of the Erdtree. In addition to the DLC's visual appeal, there's also the overall experience of playing this game. I've personally been obsessed with all forms of RPGs that are focused primarily on character customization. And for me, Elden Ring and its DLC is the preeminent game experience among these types of games. Exploring the world, finding new things while building your character in Elden Ring is truly a unique experience, and it has set the standard for what an open world ARPG should be. Shadow of the Erdtree managed to further build upon this, and to my surprise, playing it gave me the same sense of wonder and enjoyment as when I played Elden Ring for the very first time. So, is Shadow of the Erdtree an overrated game? No, not at all. The fact that it managed to go above and beyond anyone's expectations of what a DLC could be is just unprecedented. Everyone who's played this game can at least agree that they have never seen a DLC of this scale or scope. When has there ever been a DLC that's added this much content to an already enormous game? I can't even think of any that come close. I'm also not at all surprised by the critical acclaim that Shadow of the Erdtree received, and I do believe that it's well deserved. Especially seeing as how we now live in an age where AAA video game titles are intentionally designed with microtransactions that double as quality of life features by panhandling video game developers.
You have $1?
It's simply astonishing that a game as complete and masterful as Shadow of the Erdtree would go for only $40. Shadow of the Erdtree deserves praise just based on the amount of value you get for its price. What's more, had this DLC been a standalone game, I wouldn't have been disappointed by it in the slightest. I also wouldn't be surprised if the DLC received Game of the Year had it been a standalone game. There hasn't been a game that I've enjoyed playing more than I've enjoyed playing Elden Ring in recent years, and Shadow of the Erdtree has miraculously managed to replicate that monumental experience. Shadow of the Erdtree is a masterpiece. Thanks for watching. Check out my other videos.